So we started with question 8, but seemed like there was quite a bit to share. If someone perhaps would like to read it and the answer again.
Question 8. But is there any sin where there is no law? What makes sin but the law? When a man hath traveled through the law into the eternal nature, can he then commit sin? Answer. Where there is no law, there can be no transgression. But while any of that nature remains to which the law naturally belongs, there may be sin and transgression. Now that only is capable of being out of the reach of the law, whose nature is perfect, and which comprehends and cannot but bring forth the righteousness of the law in it. That, therefore, which falleth short of the righteousness of the law and pleads it is not sin to it, is in the deceit and error from the perfection, and not in the perfect righteousness, which eternally comprehends and brings forth the righteousness of the law, but is not comprehended or judged by it, because its nature, life and righteousness, is above it.
I think that this could have been addressed to ranters who were claiming that they were not bound by the law because they had reached a state of perfection, but yet they violated the law. And what Penington is saying is that for those who have reached that unity with Christ or perfection, they are not, their nature is such that they will not violate the law. But if any of the sinful nature remains within them, then they are still subject to the law. In other words, one can't say that one is beyond the law and then violate it.
This also brings up for me an image of what kind of, I'll call it, natural lawlessness the Israelites must have been in after generations of slavery in Egypt before a law was given. I mean, the Mosaic law. That's nowhere mentioned but I'm imagining that, like many enslaved people, they were used to being kept in line by fear and did what they could to survive, largely on the sneak. If they needed something to eat to feed their families with, they stole it if they could. It's um, it's a kind of, you could call it lawlessness, though I'm sympathetic to people who live like that because they can be so desperate just for survival. But you can't steal or lie without violating the light in your conscience, no matter how corrupt your society or culture might be. And I think Penington is implying that by saying this.
One of the love, sorry, John.
I was just going to make a further comment that there's some slipperiness in the word "the law," because Scripture usually uses it to refer to the Mosaic law, but it has a secondary meaning of all law, and which exists in every society to maintain order and to restrain human selfishness.
The laws are different in different societies. What they have in common is that they are humanly generated social constraints. And Christ is not of that nature. He is beyond human configuration. So there's that distinction being made between man-made law or constraints of human nature and the inward spiritual state of being that one comes into and is righteous.
I would be helped if we could, for my benefit, take this train of thought a little bit farther. Is when it talks about the law, is it talking about man-made law, or, I mean, is there like what Moses received at Mount Sinai law, or is there law, there's natural law that even preceded human creation? I'm I'd be helped if we could, for my benefit, clarify what Isaac Penington has in mind, and what he doesn't have in mind by the law.
I'm of the opinion that since he keeps using righteousness along with the law, that he's talking about the Mosaic law, but I'm open to other interpretations.
So if it's Mosaic law, then was there no sin before Mosaic law was handed down? I mean, if sin is dependent on Mosaic law to define it, you see where I'm stumbling here?
Yeah, I think in Romans there's a passage where Paul talks about those who, here it is, for when the Gentiles which have not the law do by nature the things contained in the law, these having not the law are a law unto themselves. So it's referring there to the law written in their hearts, as he goes on to say, their conscience, and also bearing witness, and their thoughts, the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. So Paul is talking about an intrinsic or inward standard of righteousness that is not dependent upon the Mosaic law. And that's what Christ is. I would say that even though the Mosaic law was divinely given, when it was applied to the society, it was enforced in a man-made way. And in that sense, it was man instituted. That passage in Romans was 2:14 through 15.
That would be my understanding, that there was a deep divine law which goes right back to the obedience of people like Abraham and things. And I think Moses was instructed and actually recorded the 10 Commandments on the tablets of stone. But, and in a sense, they're a sort of, social guide which provides some clear rules. But on the other level, they're just like a ready reckoner. Because Moses also knew that the real law was actually inward. That's the passage in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 11 to 14. Where Moses says, it's not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. It's not up in heaven, so you have to ask who will ascend into heaven and get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it. Nor is it beyond the sea that you have to ask who will cross the sea and get it and proclaim it to us so that we may obey it. No, the word is very near you, It is in your mouth and in your heart, so that you may obey it. I would say that's the deep divine law that's readily available. But for many social folks, as they were being changed, it was good to have some outward rules, which was the law. And the law, of course, in the Mosaic law was not just the 10 Commandments, a host of regulations about what you could and couldn't do and what you had to do to fix it up and so on. And then Christ has come and taught us the law that's in the tablets of the heart, moment by moment. The wonderful thing I like about this is that it does not come out and say, you know, you're all sinful and you'll never get there. In this spirituality and theology, there is a wonderful possibility of perfection. You can't actually get there. And this was very difficult, I'm sure, for many of those people in the Christian churches who'd been well schooled in original sin that doesn't get fixed up until you die. So I just find this so helpful and so positive. It's an optimistic spirituality. All that's required really is where we started off in one of Penington's earlier statements, where he says, Christ can work in you to the extent that Christ gains access into your heart. Not that Christ works in you or gets access to your brain and mind and rational thinking, but as Christ gets access into your heart. And then all these things are possible. That's gospel. That's the gospel.
To welcome Barb and Constance. We've been obviously on question 8. I think we might be ready to go on to question 9, but I'll give everybody another minute and see if anything else arises.
Just a couple of comments. You mentioned Romans. I think, I mean, that's the whole book of Romans is a wonderful legal defense, I guess. But I think Paul is somewhat going back to Abraham rather than Moses. And Moses and Abraham were not perfect. But they in Abraham, he says that Abraham had faith because there obviously was no Mosaic law for Abraham. And so he had faith. And I think that's kind of Paul's argument, and at least in part of Romans. But then Christ, a lot of the Mosaic law, it was very detailed, but it had to do with the priestly line through Aaron and the Levites. And he says with Paul, Paul says that Christ as the high priest is not of that line, but of the line of Melchizedek. So it's kind of, Paul is saying that I think it's true that the law of Christ is over the Mosaic law, and how to achieve that. I guess his perfection is through Christ, but also through faith. And so I mean I haven't spent the time on this that others here have. But then the other comment, and thinking about it, the law, if I think of the law of the state of Massachusetts and the United States, or if I put myself back in Moses' time, in some way, I mean, people have been in touch with Christ before Christ walked the earth, and there's some idea that maybe he appeared in some Christophanies, I guess they call it, even before that. But the law is to protect the people that don't break the law. and whichever law we're talking about, it's not, I mean, even in Moses' time, there were people who I would assume that did not need the law to constrain their behavior because they had the law of the Spirit. So the law is for the people who don't obey the Spirit or don't have the Spirit or something. I don't know if that's theologically correct, but that I mean, I'm glad that there's, you know, laws against breaking into my house, for instance, that might be a deterrent to somebody that might want to do that. If that person is fully in Christ, I wouldn't expect them to do that.
So perhaps we could go ahead and read question 1 under concerning faith. We have a volunteer.
I can read.
Thank you.
Question: what is faith? Answer: it is a belief in the appearances of the Lord to the soul, and a cleaving to and drinking in of their virtue. There are diverse appearances of the Lord, even as a quickening spirit, quickening and enlivening the soul. Also as a discoverer, reprover, and condemner of sin, and justifier of righteousness. Likewise, as a strengthener and comforter of that which wants his strength and comfort, and as a fountain of perfect love, sweetness, and all good, etc. Now, however, the Lord pleaseth to appear, that which seeth, knoweth, owneth, and falleth in with his appearances, drinking in the virtue thereof, that is faith. Strikes me that Penington is not talking about intellectual assent here into something. We sometimes talk about faith as intellect, as just sort of saying, yeah, I believe this. But you can also think of faith as an active living confidence. And I think that Penington here is actually saying it's an active living thing. It's an active living thing, but something you live into. It strikes me that that's what he's talking about, and not intellectual assent.
It reminds me of what I think is unique to the early Quakers was a listing of the offices of Christ as a teacher, as a bishop, as a shepherd, priest, prophet, king. I guess those were the three main offices of Christ that other faiths had, but Quakers had a whole series, counselor, whole series of different actions that Christ performed. Christ was active within. And I think that this passage in Penington emphasizes his activity. As Eileen was saying, he's an active person within the person of faith. There are verbs that are being used. He seeth, knoweth, owneth. I guess these are referring to when the Lord appears, then the person of faith sees, knows, owns, and falls in with these appearances, and he becomes in concord with, or in unity with. So the activity is what also struck me. There are several more listings up in the first part of that answer, describing Christ as a discoverer, a reprover, a condemner of sin, a justifier of righteousness, a strengthener and comforter, and a fountain of perfect love, sweetness, and of all good.
Yeah, I like the way it includes so much. As a person, Pennington is sort of expressing this feelings that a lover would have. I want to cleave to you. I want to drink you in. And yet he doesn't leave out anything. It's like, yes, there's perfect love and sweetness, and yes, there's strength, and yes, there's reprover. It's just I want to take in all of you, be part of all of these things that you bring to us. It's very, very passionate.
I would say that Christ has appeared in human hearts throughout human history. When a tribe, say, has a custom that you must treat children with tenderness and respect so long as they're members of our tribe. Otherwise, you can cook and eat them. Christ, from the beginning of time, must have told humans, no, you may not eat human children as food, no matter what tribe they come from. And people getting that message feel that it's right. They've extended they're forced to extend their definition of who is a neighbor or a fellow citizen to include everyone that's human. Mosaic law had a lot of clauses in it about how an Israelite must extend hospitality and mercy to strangers. That was, I think, a very Christ-like sort of thing, because humans, even to this day, make exceptions to the general rule about treating others humanely in the case of peoples that our people are at war with.
Are you pointing, John, to how when we experience fear that can lead to anger, faith disappears? We no longer have faith that we're all part of the same tribe and under the same Lord, and can trust that the Lord will be there for us. So
Was that a question to me, Madeline?
it was. I'm relating what you're saying to this question of faith, and perhaps the disappearance of faith when we're in the midst of fear and anger.
I have been in such rages that I felt like I wanted to murder somebody, but I also knew I shouldn't. And the impulse to take revenge is always says, break the law, break the rules, do something really hurtful, really nasty. And yet, when I search my own past experience, like as a child or an adolescent, I remember always feeling that restraining hand saying, don't. I don't know how that relates to faith, because faith is trust. In both the Latin credo and its close relative, the Sanskrit shraddha, which is almost the same word with a different pronunciation, there's the implication that there is someone or some source of goodness that we are putting our trust in. And we may not experience that, we may not experience a divine or authoritative thing or person that we are trusting when we restrain ourselves from doing destructive vengeful evil. But I guess we're always dimly aware that the forbidden evil is forbidden for a good reason, and that we're putting ourselves in deep danger if we commit the evil.
Well, Jesus was clear that it wasn't just the act, it was also what was going on inside of one that was sin. And I think that in that unity with Christ, there's a realization that that is the true substance that gives one's life meaning and joy and purpose and all of that. And that to deviate from that, to go outside of that relationship is sin, regardless of whether one acts upon some urge or anger. It's the positive substance that we are to stay in unity with, and not just refrain from harming others. It's the loss of that connection to Christ that is sin. It's not just acting upon it in the world. He has a couple of those comparisons in the Sermon on the Mount when he says, you have heard that it was said, thou shalt not kill, but I say unto you, he who is angry with his brother has already committed murder, I think he says. That doesn't seem quite right. But he's moving the error from acting upon it in the world into what is the inward state within. So the thing is to know faith, is to know this state of unity with Christ.
Well, it seems like maybe we could go ahead and read question 2, unless someone else has a comment. I don't know that we'll get through it, but we could perhaps explore it. Well, I'll go ahead and read that if that's okay. Hearing no objections. Question 2, by what means is faith wrought? By the word in the heart, by the living word from which the soul came and which is nigh to the soul. This was the word of faith, or the word which wrought faith under the law, Deuteronomy 30. This was the word of faith which the apostles preached and which brought faith under the gospel, Romans 10. This is the word which we feel working faith in us now, yea, and which worketh it in all those in whomever it is wrought, though they may not know what works it. Yea, this is the seed of life, from which every spiritual thing springs and grows in the heart.
Forgive me for speaking so often, but this reminds me of Jesus's parable of the vine. I am the vine and you are the branches. When Penington writes, by the living word from which the soul came, and which is not the soul, it reminds me that by saying that the soul came from the word, he is saying that this is really our natural condition, is to be branches or runners or seeds that came from the word. That's all I wanted to say.
It seems to me that Pennington is trying to lean towards what Paul also tries to hint at, that we can actually be transformed, that our nature can be transformed. And I know I fail at this practically every day, but that we can actually transcend our human nature. Not that we can do it, but that this faith, which is not a one and done. I believe in you, Jesus, blah, blah, blah. No. But you open the door to this Holy Spirit, and then the fruit is that you too can become holy. That's my sense of Pennington. I could be totally wrong, but I've been listening to some YouTubes about Paul and how Paul makes reference to his trips to heaven, the third heaven, or he's being very humble about it by describing himself in the third person. I know this person, and they think it was Paul himself, and that's why he was so crazy, really, about spreading the word. And he saw that this is what Christ is trying to do in us, is to transform us, turn us from our old nature.
It must have been so extraordinary at the time, the way the Quakers insisted on this being available in all times and all places, and this thing that's available includes the possibility of every spiritual thing springing up, and that perfection that was mentioned earlier. It even sounds radical now. You don't always hear this in faith groups. Religion remains quite tribal in my experience. Not always, but a lot. And it's just such a broad, open way of thinking. It's really refreshing, even several hundred years later after it's been written.
Well, I think that perfection, if you will, that completeness, that wholeness is not, we don't achieve that on our own. We need Christ to work in us and on us I think for, in time here is God's time. I think some people can probably get there faster than others, but it's the temptation it is not necessarily removed right away. And I think that comes through in the letters of Paul. Was it Romans 7 when he talks about what the flesh wants to do or something? So at least I take heart in that. What seems to be my experience, I take heart in it because I can't say that the temptation has left me. But I think slowly my desires change, and that's part of the transformation power that he has, that my desires become his desires. And so in that, the temptation gets less and less until it disappears and changes. And that's what I'm talking about, one tiny aspect of my life. So there are a lot of those that sort of get uncovered as I live with him. But I can see how our desires have to change to his desires. It's not this, or isn't supposed to be, this constant struggle once we're transformed, right? It's supposed to be love, to use a word, rather than terror or rot. When I see rot, that's the working, that's sort of, meat tenderizing or heart tenderizing, that word to me. But that we change, and we change as we become more like him. Our desires become his desires, and the temptation, one can hope, and I guess I've seen in my own life, the temptation is also lessened or gone. But then there's another learning in another area, so it just keeps going.
We are a little bit past our time, so I think we'll have to stop there, but can certainly come back to this and go on next time. I will stop this sharing. Sorry, David had to go.
I guess I have to go too.
Oh, this conference. All right. Well, thank
Sorry.
you. Thank you, everybody.